Hello and welcome to the Ukrainian Museum of Canada. My name is Jen Budny and I serve as Executive Director here. I am very pleased to be introducing our first online lecture series created and narrated by our Research and Communications Officer, John Koenig. This series looks at the leadership and innovation of Ukrainian artists in the development of avant-garde modern art in the first half of the 20th century, working side by side with artists such as Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse. As you will see, in the traditional narratives of art history, many Ukrainian artists have been subsumed into the national identities of other avant-garde movements, such as the Russian avant-garde or the French. But the fact is that so many of these artists either self-identified as Ukrainian or attributed their innovation to their Ukrainian roots. When John is not at the museum, he teaches art history at the University of Saskatchewan. To create this lecture series, he drew on the extensive research of scholars around the world who have dedicated their careers to revealing the importance of Ukrainian artists in the development of 20th century modern art. For those of you who want more detailed information, we highly recommend these monographs, which have been published over the last few decades. Meanwhile, please enjoy the first installment of our three-part series. This one is titled Ukrainians in the Vanguard, where we provide an overview of some of the most important Ukrainian artists who were instrumental in the foundation and fluorescence of the artistic avant-garde in the 20th century.
The year is 1913, and the city is Paris, the City of Lights. The Eiffel Tower was a mere 24 years old at this time, completed in 1889 as the centerpiece for the Exposition Universelle. Artists from every corner of the globe were flocking to Paris, which had established itself as the internationally recognized capital for innovation in the arts. Artists would gather on the boulevards to browse leaflets and local newspapers for information on the latest exhibitions, or they would congregate in the many cafes and cabarets that lined the Parisian streets to discuss and debate artistic theory and practice. And arriving by train in that autumn of 1913 would be one such artist, who would arrive at the Gare de l'Est, the train station for trains coming from the east. That artist was a 28-year-old Ukrainian by the name of Volodymyr Tatlin. Tatlin was born in Moscow, but grew up in Kharkiv, Ukraine, and would later work as a merchant marine out of Odessa. While studying art in Moscow, he would become aware of the innovative experiments of Pablo Picasso and other Cubist painters in Paris, and he dearly longed to head west, like many of his artist friends, to immerse himself in the Parisian artistic scene. In 1913, he got his chance. He agreed to the proposal of a Russian princess to participate in her exhibition of folk art in Berlin, specifically to act as a blind bandura player with a group of Ukrainian musicians. The bandura is the national instrument for Ukraine, and Tatlin was an accomplished bandura player. Indeed, for this trip to Berlin, Tatlin not only made his own costume with a Ukrainian embroidered shirt, he also built his own bandura. After the exhibition in Berlin, Tatlin continued on to Paris with one primary objective: to meet Pablo Picasso, play the bandura for him, and sing Ukrainian Duma songs, with the hopes of remaining in Picasso's employment as an assistant. Picasso himself had arrived in Paris from Spain at the turn of the century with his friend and traveling companion Carlos Casagemas. While in Paris, Casagemas committed suicide over unrequited love, and Picasso, trying to deal with the tragic loss of his good friend, entered into his melancholic blue period, represented here by the old guitarist, sometimes known as the blind guitarist. Soon, however, Picasso would transition into his rose period, dominated by circus performers and harlequins, and then into his famed Cubist phase. With a subdued palette and broken planes, Cubism was fundamentally an investigation into form. By shifting perspective on the subject of the painting, moving around the subject, so to speak, Cubism sought to represent the subject from multiple perspectives at the same time. This was known as analytic Cubism, wherein the subject is broken down and analyzed from different perspectives. By the time Tatlin arrived in Paris, however, Picasso had already moved on to a new form of art known as synthetic Cubism. Rather than breaking down and analyzing form, synthetic Cubism built up form through the synthesis of various elements and media, primarily through papier-collé or paper collage. Picasso would extend this form of art into 3 dimensions to create the first known sculpture that was produced neither through modeling, like molded clay, nor through extraction, like carved marble. This new form of sculpture was constructed, an entirely new way of representing 3-dimensional subject matter, as exemplified here by Picasso's guitar. And when Tatlin arrived in Picasso's studio in Paris, this is exactly what he would see. The studies, drawings, and maquettes of Picasso's guitar, arranged over the wall above his bed. In this meeting, Tatlin made every effort to stay as Picasso's student or assistant, even offering to sweep his floors and stretch his canvases. According to Tatlin, they communicated by gestures and drawings, but understood each other perfectly. Unfortunately, Tatlin was ultimately unsuccessful in his efforts. As a gift, Picasso gave Tatlin tubes of paint and brushes, but then promptly showed him the door. So Tatlin returned east, not back to Ukraine, but back to Moscow, where he had attended art school, and it was here that he began creating art directly influenced by what he experienced in Picasso's studio on that fateful day. Tatlin's new art consisted of various materials brought together into constructions known as counter-reliefs or corner reliefs, which he eventually exhibited at a prominent exhibition in St. Petersburg, Russia, the 010 exhibition. Through these constructions and through the exhibition, he connected with other like-minded artists in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and together they established a new art movement in 1915 known as Russian constructivism. Constructivist art was abstract, geometrical, and austere, and sought to reflect modern industrial and urban society. When the Bolsheviks came to power after the October revolutions of 1917, the constructivist aesthetic was appropriated to serve the state, and it became an art for propaganda and social purposes, as we see here in the work of Russian constructivists Alexander Rodchenko and L. Lissitzky. As one of the founding members of Russian constructivism, Tatlin would eventually create a monument that would come to represent both the newly established Soviet state and his newly established art movement of constructivism. This new icon was known as Tatlin's Tower. The tower is an architectural structure that was both symbolic and functional, symbolic of utopian aspirations and functional to house the Third International, or the Comintern, the international communist organization working for world revolution. It was designed to straddle the Neva River in St. Petersburg and consists of a contracting double helix that spirals upward, supported by a huge diagonal girder, inside of which are 4 geometric volumes that were intended to revolve at different speeds. This structure not only became an iconic symbol for Soviet Union and the revolution, but also became an iconic symbol of Russian constructivism itself as an avant-garde art movement. But as some commentators have noted, it is difficult not to see within the form of this icon to the Soviet state and Russian constructivism the armature of a wooden bandura, the traditional musical instrument of Ukraine and an instrument dear to the heart of this Ukrainian artist. So the underlying inspiration for this work, this icon of Russian constructivism, is perhaps Tatlin's own Ukrainian heritage, hidden within the lattice structure of Tatlin's Tower. And this may serve as a metaphor for the way in which the avant-garde in the Russian context subsumes the identity of a Ukrainian avant-garde, of innovation and inspiration derived from the Ukrainian roots of artists who either self-identified as Ukrainian or drew substantially from their Ukrainian heritage in the pursuit of innovative artistic styles. as Tatlin did with his passion for the bandura. And so, in this presentation, we will meet other Ukrainian avant-garde artists, many of whom are not normally recognized as Ukrainian, but whose Ukrainian roots help us understand and interpret the innovations that characterize their work, and the critical contributions that they had made to an artistic phenomenon that many scholars identify as the Ukrainian avant-garde. However, before we talk about the Ukrainian avant-garde, perhaps it may be useful to talk about what we mean about the avant-garde in art. Avant-garde is originally a French military term, meaning advance guard, the forward echelon of the army that comes into contact with the opposing army first. The coining of the term is credited to a socialist thinker by the name of Henri de Saint-Simon, who describes the avant-garde thusly: "We artists will serve you as an avant-garde. The power of the arts is most immediate. When we want to spread new ideas, we inscribe them on marble or canvas. What a magnificent destiny for the arts is that of exercising a positive power over society, a true priestly function, and of marching in the van of all the intellectual faculties." So the term is applicable to all art that pushes the boundaries of ideas, creativity, and innovation, an art that is radical and reflects originality of vision, usually with a thrust of politics as implied by Saint-Simon's quote. And so avant-garde art is characterized by innovation and experimentation, which explains the introduction of all the isms throughout this period. We have already met cubism of Picasso and the constructivism of Tatlin, but there are many more isms that we will encounter, including fauvism, orphism, futurism, and suprematism. But to understand the Ukrainian avant-garde of the early 20th century, it is also important to understand the geopolitical context of Ukraine at this time. In traditional art historical narratives, artistic influence in the region of Ukraine is often expressed along a north-south axis, with emphasis on the influence of Moscow and St. Petersburg. By the late Russian Empire in the first decade of the 20th century, however, communication and travel along an east-west axis became more accessible, and this became even more prominent after the fall of the Russian Empire in the 1917 revolutions, when the Ukrainian nationalists momentarily gained political power, and Ukraine itself became an independent nation for approximately 2 years. This is why this particular map, published in 1919, exists. It represents a material and political announcement to the world that Ukraine was independent. One Ukrainian artist who would take advantage of increasing access to the West, especially to Paris, the artistic capital of the world at this time, was the incomparable female Ukrainian artist Aleksandra Ekster. Exter was born in Bialystok, in a region that is now part of Poland. But in childhood, her family moved to Kyiv, where she attended the Kyiv Art School and graduated in painting in 1906. Like many artists, including Tatlin, she too would make her way to Paris and meet artistic luminaries such as Pablo Picasso and his French Cubist colleague Georges Braque. Her exposure to Picasso, Cubism, and the vibrant artistic scene of Paris would make a distinct impression on this young Ukrainian artist, and ultimately inspire her to participate in the publication of the first ever monograph about Pablo Picasso and his Cubism. Written by the Russian poet Ivan Aksionov, Exter designed the cover and likely edited the manuscript, if not wrote the substantial portions of it. Ultimately, Exter's exposure to Picasso influenced her own work, which was also Cubist in style. The difference, however, lay in her use of color. As we noted earlier, for Picasso, Cubism was fundamentally an investigation into form. To help him in this endeavor, Picasso would use a subdued and monochromatic color palette to avoid any unnecessary distractions to a single-minded focus of exploring form. For Exter and her fellow Ukrainian artists, however, Cubism was no longer merely an investigation into form, but a platform for a distinctively Ukrainian expression of color, a Cubist innovation that can arguably be attributed to another remarkable Ukrainian female artist by the name of Sonia Delaunay, whom we shall meet momentarily. Back in Kyiv, Exter's studio at 27 Funikulievskaya Street would become a salon and an art school where Ukrainian artists from all over would gather, including David Burliuk, known as the father of Russian futurism, and Aleksandr Bohomazov, affectionately known as the Ukrainian Picasso, both of whom, like Delaunay, we shall meet later. And these artists that gathered at Exter's salon would eventually come together to organize, under the directorship of Exter, the very first major avant-garde exhibition to be held anywhere in the Russian Empire, specifically at a modest Ukrainian music store in Kyiv. This was known as the Link Exhibition. The Link Exhibition, organized by Exter, David Burliuk, and his brother Volodymyr Burliuk, was a veritable scandal. Critics wrote about the Link, calling it an exhibition of talentless artists and a terrible, savage phenomenon. The reviews and feedback were published by all of the municipal dailies, and caricatures, like this one on the right, were produced to mock the exhibition. In the lower register of this caricature, one can see the gallery patrons fleeing the scene of the crime. Unfortunately, only a few works from this exhibition are known. The vast majority have not survived to this day. And although the reviews were harsh, they did generate a lot of public exposure for these Ukrainian artists and the innovative art that they were producing. In her remarkable career, Alexandra Exter was not only involved in painting, publishing, teaching, and exhibitions. This versatile Ukrainian female artist was also involved in stage, theater, and film. Here, we see her contributions to the 1924 Russian science fiction film Aelita, Queen of Mars. It tells the story of an engineer from Earth who travels to Mars, where he leads a popular uprising against the ruling class, with the support of the Martian queen Aelita, who had fallen in love with the engineer after watching him through her telescope from Mars. One modern critic of the film described it as a strange production in which the human pastime of kissing creates turmoil on the red planet. Nonetheless, Exter's costume and stage designs for this film are inspired, and although the film was produced in black and white, the full effect of Exter's genius is preserved in a set of prints of many of her other stage designs published in 1930. Here, we can see the remarkable genius of this Ukrainian female artist. Her use of color, strong verticals, and the effective use of light are hallmarks of her work, and, as we shall see, is representative of the aesthetic of many Ukrainian avant-garde artists at this time, including the Ukrainian Picasso, Aleksandr Bohomazov. The artist, however, who inspired Exter, who gave her insight into the potential uses of color, is another remarkable female artist who explicitly credits her childhood in Ukraine for her innovations in art. And that artist is the Ukrainian-born Sonia Delaunay. Delaunay is actually considered by many as a French artist who spent most of her working life in Paris. But she was actually born in Odessa to Jewish parents, and later in life she would credit her childhood in Ukraine as the inspiration for her innovative use of color. Her initial style was known as fauvism, most frequently represented by the work of French master Henri Matisse. Fauvism is characterized by the bold use of color and the liberal use of pattern, and Delaunay attributes her affinity for color and pattern, and hence for fauvism, directly to her childhood memories in Ukraine. In her diary, Delaunay would reminisce about her childhood. "The memories of a small girl," she wrote in her diary, "who once lived amid the fields of Ukraine, remain memories in bright colors. There she is, going to her father at lunchtime, walking down a path cut between two walls of snow that are 3 times as high as she is. All around her are white cottages, long and low, that seem to have grown like mushrooms. Soon the winter disappears, and a merry sun flashes out of an endless sky. Melons and watermelons are ripening, tomatoes girdle the vegetable gardens like a red sash, and large sunflowers with black hearts shoot into the blue, bright, berry-high sky. There is joy, balance, and belief of life on this good black earth." These are the memories of Sonia Delaunay, and this is the spirit of her art, and why she began as a fauvist with its extraordinary color. As is apparent from Matisse's Harmony in Red and Delaunay's Philomene, Fauvism's use of color and pattern has the tendency to collapse the illusion of space in the image and highlight the presence of the picture plane. The subject matter is not only the subject depicted, but also the subject of artistic practice itself, its materials, its canvas, its frame. This is similar to Cubism in its effect. As noted earlier, Cubism was fundamentally an exploration into form, and one of the consequences of this exploration is the collapse of space in the image, and an emphasis on the picture plane represented by the canvas itself. However, whereas Cubism achieves this effect through a deconstruction of the subject into planar elements, Fauvism achieves this effect through the deployment of color and pattern. In Matisse's Harmony in Red, for example, his use of color and pattern makes it difficult to distinguish the horizontal table from the vertical wall, thereby collapsing space in the image. In Picasso's Girl with a Mandolin, space collapses due to the spatial ambiguity between the planar elements of the subject and those planar elements supposedly behind the subject. Both of these styles were prominent in Paris at this time, and so Sonia Delaunay, the Fauvist, was well aware of the formal experiments of Picasso and the Cubists. And this is where the Ukrainian ingenuity of Sonia Delaunay would make an important contribution to the trajectory of avant-garde art, an innovation to the Cubist aesthetic which she again would credit to her Ukrainian heritage. As she would later write in her memoir, about 1911 I had the idea of making for my son, who had just been born, a blanket composed of bits of fabric like those I had seen in the houses of Ukrainian peasants. When it was finished, the arrangement of the pieces of material seemed to me to evoke Cubist conceptions, and we then tried to apply the same process to other objects and paintings. And so Sonia Delaunay, along with her husband Robert, proceeded to inject Fauvist color into the monochromatic palette of Picasso's Cubism, thereby fusing the two styles together to create what has come to be known as orphism. Orphism is a term coined in 1912 by French poet Guillaume Apollinaire, who regarded the colorful Cubist-inspired paintings of Delaunay as initiating a new style that brought musical qualities to painting. He named the style orphism in reference to Orpheus, the legendary poet and singer of ancient Greek mythology, who is symbolic of the mystically inspired artist. The Delaunays themselves would call their new style simultaneism, a mode of art centered not on the representation of real-world figures, objects, or scenes, but rather on the simultaneous contrast of colors. In other words, using color theory tied to spiritual connotation. And it may be no accident that Sonia Delaunay's very first Orphic work would be about the Bal Bullier, the dance hall in Paris where she and her husband, Robert, spent many an evening. In her memoir, she would write of memories of the peasant weddings of my country, where the red and green dresses, ornamented with many ribbons, flew about in dancing. And this is, indeed, what we experience in this Orphic work, the Bal Bullier. And so, according to Delaunay herself, the innovation of adding color to Cubism was fundamentally of Ukrainian inspiration, a credit that is not often noted nor considered in the art historical canon. Sonia Delaunay would continue to work in this style for much of her career, producing the arabesques of Orphic or simultaneous compositions such as electrical prisms, market and minho, and rhythm, a reference to the musical qualities of the style identified by Guillaume Apollinaire. But like Aleksandra Ekster, Sonia Delaunay was a very versatile artist, and she would transfer her simultaneous style into another passion, the art of high fashion. In the 1920s, Delaunay created her fashion house Casa Sonia in Madrid, Spain, and she would transfer the simultaneous spirit into many of her clothing designs, like this coat designed for American actress and producer Gloria Swanson. Indeed, after designing simultaneous driving caps for female motorists in the 1920s, Delaunay was invited to decorate the body of one of Citroën's new B12 automobiles, with simultaneous patterning based on one of her fabric designs. The car was unveiled at the Paris Motor Show in October 1925, and the image below is a modern reproduction that gives an idea of what the car would have looked like. All of these simultaneous fashion statements are the final outcome of Delaunay's color interventions into cubism early in her career, interventions that she directly attributes to her childhood and experiences in her birth country of Ukraine. And this is what her good friend, Alexandra Exter, would bring back with her to her school and salon in Kyiv after her stay in Paris, and assimilating the innovative styles of both Pablo Picasso and Sonia Delaunay. One artist who frequented Exter's salon and benefited from this exchange was a prolific Ukrainian artist who became affectionately known as the Ukrainian Picasso, an artist by the name of Aleksandr Bohomazov. Bohomazov was born in Yempyl in the Donetsk Oblast of Ukraine, but lived virtually all of his life in Kyiv. He was closely associated with Exter and her salon, and was heavily influenced by the color interventions of Exter's cubism, as inspired by Sonia Delaunay. But there is something else going on with both Bohomazov's paintings, as is readily apparent in his self-portrait. Bohomazov's work is characterized by bold colors and strong verticals, very reminiscent of Alexandra Ekster's stage designs that we had seen earlier. But there is a new element in these works, an element of motion and of speed, as hinted by the subject matter such as locomotive and tramway. This is in contradistinction to the monochromatic cubism of Picasso or the early color cubism of Alexandra Exter, which are more compositionally static. Indeed, Bohomazov is in fact drawing inspiration from another avant-garde art movement prominent at this time, an innovative movement known as Futurism. Futurism is an art movement that has its origins in Italy in the first decade of the 20th century, and it was an art movement based on speed and technology. The work of Italian futurist Luigi Russolo and his dynamism of a car is typical of this style. As the futurists would assert in their manifesto, quote, "We declare that the splendor of the world has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed. A racing automobile with its bonnet adorned with great tubes like serpents with explosive breath, a roaring motor car which seems to run a machine gun fire is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace." End quote. This is the aesthetic that Bohomazov would incorporate into his compositions. And so, in the same way that Sonia Delaunay would fuse fauvism with cubism, Bohomazov's composition fuses futurism with cubism to create cubo-futurism. Cubo-futurism is a type of cubism that rejects stasis and incorporates the effect of movement and speed as a metaphor for progress. This would become one of the most predominant styles of the Ukrainian avant-garde, and, as we have already seen, Aleksandra Exter herself would also deploy it in her theater and stage designs. Many of the artists, including Bogomazov, who gathered at Exter's studio, would eventually adopt this style. Through his association with this group of dynamic Ukrainian artists gathering at Exter's studio in Kyiv, Bogomazov would be responsible for a second major avant-garde exhibition in the Ukrainian capital, known as the Ring Exhibition. This exhibition was more well received than the previous Link Exhibition. Bogomazov himself exhibited 88 paintings at this exhibition, and it was here that he received the moniker of the Ukrainian Picasso. As a platform for Bogomazov's cubo-futurism, this exhibition played a critical role in highlighting the innovation of Ukrainian artists in the context of the Russian avant-garde. It should be noted, however, that Bogomazov did not invent cubo-futurism in the same way that Sonia Delaunay founded orphism and Tatlin founded constructivism. However, the innovation of cubo-futurism was indeed invented and promoted by another remarkable Ukrainian artist whom we had already briefly met in the context of the Link exhibition. That artist is David Burliuk. Burliuk was born in the village of Ryabushki, near Lebedin, Ukraine, and his family partly descended from Ukrainian Cossacks on their father's side. David Burliuk was unabashedly Ukrainian, and he took pride in his Cossack heritage. There's even a legend in his family that in the famous realist painting by Ilya Repin, Reply to the Zaporizhian Cossacks, his father was the model for the half-naked Cossack sitting at the table, the burly individual with a sword slung on his side and a bandura laying on his lap. David Burliuk was nothing if not grandly self-promotional, as we can tell by his flamboyant demeanor and attire. And so many of his paintings are about Cossacks, including this one, Cossack Mame, a Ukrainian folkloric hero. But notice the style. It's what we call naive primitivism, a very crude, naive style. It's not that Burliuk did not know how to paint. It was a conscious choice. So for example, Death Rider in the upper left is a cubo-futurist composition. In fact, as I said before, Burliuk is considered the father of Russian futurism and the founder of cubo-futurism. But these monikers are consequences not of his painting, but of his writing, because futurism was as much a literary movement as it was a visual art movement. Burliuk and his brothers formed the futurist literary group known as Hylia in 1910 at their estate near Kherson, Ukraine, which soon afterwards transformed into a literary cubo-futurism, the predominant form of futurism in Russia. And it is through these efforts and the promotion of their futurism throughout Ukraine and Russia that earns David Burliuk the honor of being labeled the father of Russian futurism. Meanwhile, in 1912, Burliuk's friend and mentor, Vasily Kandinsky, invited him to take part in the Avant-garde exhibition in Almanac of Der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider, in which he published The Savages of Russia, one of his most influential essays. But it would be Burliuk's primitive, naive paintings that he would become known for in the visual arts. In the avant-garde, primitivism is a common strategy to break away from conventional modes of representation and aspire to recreate a so-called primitive experience, a utopian ideal that moves beyond the moral bankruptcy of our own existing society and envision a new society, a new way of being. Hence, in the French avant-garde, Picasso and Gauguin would look to the so-called primitive styles of African masks, in the case of Picasso, or the exotic subject matter of the Polynesian islands, in the case of Gauguin. And herein lies a difference between the primitivism of the international avant-garde, led by the French, and the Ukrainian avant-garde. The international avant-garde looked for so-called primitivist inspiration beyond their borders, to the colonies of Africa, Southeast Asia, or the South Seas. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian avant-garde, such as David Burliuk, looked for primitivist inspiration from the history and culture of Ukraine itself. As a nation struggling for its own identity, Ukraine, its soil, its color, its culture, became the foundation for inspiration for many members of the Ukrainian avant-garde, including David Burliuk. To close this presentation, we will discuss one other Ukrainian artist who would also draw substantially from his Ukrainian heritage, and that artist was Kazimir Malevich. Malevich was born in Kiev, but his family would move often between different Ukrainian villages, where he would be exposed to embroidery and the many decorated walls and stoves of the traditional Ukrainian village dwelling. He studied art, however, at the Moscow School of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture, and he would gradually work through many of the traditional art movements at that time: Impressionism, Symbolism, Fauvism, and Cubism. But he would take the Cubist aesthetic to the limit, to its logical conclusion, a complete geometric abstraction. Malevich would coin this type of painting Suprematism, which, according to his writings, sought to access the supremacy of pure feeling and spirituality by discarding the world of natural forms and subject matter. In other words, by developing an aesthetic of pure abstraction. In fact, Malevich would be a contender along with Vasily Kandinsky for the invention of abstraction in avant-garde art. Even if Malevich was not the first into pure abstraction, there can be no doubt that he and his suprematist movement is one of the cornerstones of abstract art. Malevich would later recognize the influence of his peasant village upbringing on his painting, which would lead art critic Dmitry Horbachev to assert that the closest analogy to Malevich's Suprematism are the geometrical forms of wall paintings in the homes of Podillia, the Pashenka, or painted Easter eggs with their astral signs, and the patterns of the plakta woven women's skirt with their magical code of universal elements. In terms of this painting on the right, for example, one should note the resemblance of this painting to traditional Motanka guardian dolls, commonly made to protect the Ukrainian household from evil spirits and events. Malevich would continuously draw from his Ukrainian village experiences, not only in reflection and influence, but as commentary and protest. The Motanka doll, for example, may also provide the foundational form for the faceless, mannequin-like figures that Malevich produces in the 1930s. These paintings are scenes of protest for the forced collectivization of Ukrainian people at this time, a period marked by the artificial famine of the years 1932 to 33. Known as the Holodomor, this artificial famine, created by the Soviet state, would kill upwards of 4 to 10 million Ukrainians. But many of these paintings by Malevich are backdated, because such commentary at this time would have landed him in prison, or worse, execution. And so, on the back of Malevich's painting Complex Presentiment of 1928 to 32, Malevich has inscribed the following description. Quote, "The composition is made up of the elements of the sensation of emptiness, loneliness, and the hopelessness of life." 1913, Kuntsevo. End quote. Of course, the painting was not painted in 1913. Here, Malevich is in fact describing his feelings and protest for the horrors subjected to the Ukrainian people at the time that he actually painted this painting, the 1930s, during the Holodomor. Kazimir Malevich, this cornerstone to abstraction and avant-garde art, was Ukrainian through and through. Volodymyr Tatlin, the founder of constructivism. Aleksandra Ekster, artist, teacher, organizer, and theater designer extraordinaire. Sonia Delaunay, founder of orphism. Oleksandr Bohomazov, the Ukrainian Picasso. David Burliuk, the father of futurism. And Kazimir Malevich, one of the cornerstones to abstraction. All of these artists were leading innovators in the international avant-garde, and all of them either self-identified as Ukrainian, such as Malevich, Burliuk, Bogomazov, and Exter, or drew substantially from their Ukrainian heritage in the pursuit of innovative artistic styles, such as Delaunay's color interventions, or Tatlin and his Bandura. These are only a few members of what many scholars have now identified as the Ukrainian avant-garde, an avant-garde that is often subsumed into the arts of the Russian or the French avant-garde. In part 2 of this lecture series, we will focus on émigré Ukrainian artists in the artistic capital of Paris, where they congregated on the bohemian boulevards of Montparnasse, at the Atelier of La Ruche, or the Beehive, and participated in the first Ukrainian association in Paris, known as the Romada.